In September 2023, a retired NYCHA repairman pried open a rusted radiator casing in Harlem's St. Nicholas houses. Behind the drywall, a safe embedded in the structure, packed with 1,980s cash and a handwritten ledger listing city payouts to phantom contractors. The discovery unearthed a scandal buried since 1982. $1.7 million, gone without indictment. 4 decades of silence, undone by a leaking pipe. On September 17, 2023, Aaron Coles returned to the building where his career had begun 4 decades earlier. Unit 4E of the St. Nicholas houses had reported a persistent radiator leak. The tenant, an elderly woman who had lived there since 1981, noted that the floorboards near the window were beginning to buckle and the heat had been inconsistent since the previous winter. Aaron, now 61 and semi-retired, had taken the call as a favor. The new hires at NYCHA weren't moving fast, and the resident had requested someone who knew the bones of the building. Aaron did. He'd installed parts of them himself in the early 1980s. When he arrived that morning, the radiator was bleeding rust-stained water into the warped parquet tiles. Beneath the paint, the casing was bloated, its screws eaten by years of condensation. As he worked the panel loose, the tenant recounted how contractors had once torn open half the stairwell for repairs, then never returned. The panel groaned as Aaron pried it free. The drywall behind it was soft, sagging inward like a pocket. He peeled it back gently, expecting old insulation or mold. What he found instead was metal, not pipes, but the corner of a steel box, embedded deep in the wall framing. It was flush with the studs, sealed with brackets, and slotted behind what looked like an original plaster layer. No markings, no keyhole. He stepped back. The tenant leaned in beside him. "That's not plumbing," she said quietly. The floor was still damp, but Aaron steadied himself and chipped away at the plaster perimeter. The box was about 14 inches wide and 10 inches tall, painted in oxidized gray. Near the bottom edge, a seam had corroded just enough to wedge a screwdriver in. It took 20 minutes, and a retired man's patience to work the front open. Inside were stacks of cash paper-wrapped bundles, faded but intact. Most bore rubber bands turned brittle with age, and manila envelopes labeled with the words "City Contractor Priority." The scent was unmistakable, old money and mildew. Beside the cash lay a ledger. Its cover was soft leather, the spine cracked from decades of compression. Inside, in tight ink, were rows of dates, vendor names, and 6-figure amounts. Every entry bore a signature. Many signatures. One of them Aaron recognized immediately. He closed the book, his hands suddenly trembling in the dim light. There was no question about what this was. But no sirens went off. No headlines printed themselves. Instead, Aaron made a phone call not to the police, but to a name in his flip phone. A man he hadn't spoken to in years, who once supervised Building 5 and still had friends at the department. By sundown, the radiator was capped. The box was gone. And a 41-year-old mystery had begun to stir. In the spring of 1982, Harlem's St. Nicholas houses were promised transformation. On paper, the project was a turning point at a low, $4.2 million allocated from federal housing and urban development funds under a discretionary repair program targeting urgent structural decay in public housing. For the thousands of tenants spread across the sprawling complex between 127th and 131st Streets, it was more than a budget line. It was a promise of dignity. NYCHA officials issued notices in 5 languages, posting schedules in building lobbies and mailing pamphlets to every unit. The improvements were critical: functioning elevators in 3 towers, new boilers in 4, reinforced stairwells, asbestos remediation, and basement flood prevention. Contractors were selected through a closed bid system, with 3 lead firms awarded primary contracts. Subcontractors, plumbers, electricians waste removers were slotted in by the end of June. The work began quickly. Scaffolding surrounded buildings 3 and 5 by early July. Men in Navy coveralls hauled in tools and piping. Dump trucks removed debris from condemned crawl spaces. Residents were wary but cautiously optimistic. Repairs in public housing were rare, and when they came, they often brought more chaos than improvement. Still, for the first time in years, it seemed like someone was paying attention. Inside the NYCHA offices on Chapel Street, binders were compiled. Progress reports were typed on carbon triplicate. Signatures from city oversight, liaisons, auditors, engineers, clerks marked each milestone. But by late August, something shifted. Work crews began thinning. Deliveries stopped arriving. One tenant, a retired sanitation worker in Building 2, later recalled seeing men cover fresh conduit work with plywood and tape, as if preparing to walk away. By the end of September, all visible work ceased. No official explanation was given. The pamphlets remained posted, sun-bleached and curling at the corners, until residents tore them down themselves. When questioned, building managers shrugged. The funds didn't clear. Contract dispute. Weather delay. Answers varied by floor. The community board submitted formal complaints to NYCHA by October. 2 were returned without response. A third was received, stamped, and filed but never answered. Behind closed doors, confusion deepened. Of the original, $4.2 million, $2.5 million had been spent, at least according to payment ledgers. But the work on site accounted for barely half that. There were no arrests. No press releases, just silence. The New York Times ran a single paragraph in its city brief. Renovation efforts at Harlem's St. Nicholas houses, funded by HUD allocation, appear suspended. City officials declined comment. Then, the story disappeared. The complex remained in stasis. Stairwells rusted. Heaters clanked and failed. The elevators broke again. And somewhere in the paper trail, somewhere between the typed signatures and misfiled invoices, $1.7 million simply vanished. By the winter of 1982, the buildings at St. Plast, Nicholas houses had returned to their old rhythms: groaning pipes, flickering hallway lights, the dull churn of broken heating systems. The scaffolding remained for weeks, then vanished overnight. The noise of construction gave way to the more familiar quiet of disrepair. The silence was more than physical. Calls from tenants to the NYCHA borough office were met with polite deflection or long hold times that ended in disconnection. Some residents visited the office in person, only to be told their assigned caseworker was unavailable. For the building superintendents, the directive was clear but unspoken. Stop asking questions. Internal NYCHA communication during those months remains fragmentary. Archived memos reference budget realignments and contractor delivery inconsistencies, vague phrasing that avoided assigning blame. One document, marked confidential and dated December 6, 1982, lists the Harlem project among temporarily suspended repair initiatives due to incomplete documentation compliance. It was never publicly circulated. Meanwhile, the vendor logs continued to show payments. City disbursement records, later recovered in parts, indicated that invoices were processed well into early 1983. Names of contractors appeared alongside work descriptions for services that had no physical trace. Foundation clearance, Building 7. Elevator modernization, Build EGs, 3-5. Lead paint stabilization, stairwells. No inspections were filed, no follow-ups logged. A junior clerk assigned to the project recalled years later that entire folders of vendor forms would arrive pre-signed and pre-dated. He had questioned it once. His supervisor told him, "We don't hold the pen, we just push the paper." Among tenants, stories began to circulate. One woman claimed she saw men remove copper wiring and load it into vans labeled as city property. Another believed she recognized a contractor in a local bar bragging about a government job that paid like a scratch-off. But no one filed official reports. Many had learned that to complain too loudly was to risk a visit from housing enforcement, often leading to unexpected inspections and lease reviews. By spring of 1983, the project was no longer mentioned at board meetings. City Council records show the funding line was closed, redirected to a sanitation infrastructure program by June. No hearings were held. No audits were announced. The last recorded reference in a NYCHA internal log appears in April, in a scheduling note. SNH 82 RPR final status, NYCHA, no further action. The silence was complete. The paper trail stopped breathing, and for 41 years, the radiator in Unit 4E stood quietly over a box in the wall. A box no one remembered sealing, and no one dared reopen. In the summer of 1983, an internal inquiry was quietly initiated within NYCHA's Capital Projects Division. The catalyst was routine. A quarterly variance report had flagged an anomaly in repair fund utilization. According to the ledger, nearly $1.7 million in contractor payments for the St. Nicholas renovation lacked corresponding work orders. It was the kind of discrepancy that usually triggered follow-up audits, but in this case, the escalation stopped short. A junior compliance officer, Rosalind Varga, was assigned to gather documentation for the Harlem project. Over the course of 3 weeks, she visited the Municipal Records Annex on Lafayette Street multiple times. What she found or failed to find would later become the center of quiet speculation. Varga's notes, preserved in her personal archive, detailed missing invoice packets, absent contractor certifications, and an absence of correspondence logs. The file room clerk confirmed that several boxes listed in the registry designated SNH RPR 82A through E had been checked out by a senior auditor in February but never returned. No tracking card remained. The auditor in question had retired weeks earlier. Rosalind documented her findings in a standard discrepancy memo. It included a request for retrieval or reconstruction of 5 core file sets. Her supervisor initialed it. The following Monday, she was reassigned to a compliance rotation for Brooklyn's storm drainage upgrades. The Harlem inquiry was reassigned to a different office. The memo was never logged into the formal audit queue. 3 months later, an internal NYCHA oversight meeting included a passing mention of the St. Nicholas suspension. Meeting minutes show only a single sentence: pending contractor reconciliation in progress. No further action was recorded. The audit trail ended not in obstruction, but in quiet misplacement. A single overstuffed records room, a misfiled signature sheet, and a network of rotating personnel were all it took to sink the paper trail beneath a sea of bureaucracy. Meanwhile, at St. Nicholas, residents continued to live with the consequences. One elevator remained out of service for months. A third-floor tenant suffered carbon monoxide exposure from an improperly sealed boiler vent. Maintenance logs began to reflect growing delay times, an early sign of a backlog that would balloon in the decades to come. The money was gone. The records had vanished. And no one in a position to investigate had the context or the mandate to press further. Years passed. Personnel retired. Buildings aged. And in the depths of the NYCHA archive system, 5 boxes once tied to Harlem's broken promises remained permanently off record, lost or removed. No one could say for sure. In the summer of 1981, at 19, Aaron Coles walked through the courtyard of St. Nicholas Houses for the first time as a NYCHA apprentice. The sun shone on peeling paint and rusting railings, but to Aaron it felt like opportunity. He carried a toolbox heavier than he was, but brimmed with confidence taught to him by his first foreman, Michael Stanton, an exacting man with a clipped mustache who treated the hulking brick towers as if they were living machines. Aaron's earliest tasks were modest: replacing corroded radiator valves, replenishing boiler gaskets, and learning to read the yellowed blueprints stapled to the basement bulletin board. He watched Stanton sketch corrective piping in red ink directly onto the plans, then saw him vanish for days with unsigned invoices. When Stanton returned, the paper trail always cleaned up, no loose ends, no questions. By October of that year, the federal HUD award had come through. Aaron helped haul in new wrought iron stairwell rails, labeled "Property of U.S. Government," and stacked gleaming radiators in a fenced-off corner of the central boiler room. He learned to mix mortar to a perfect smoothness for patching holes left by removed piping. On some nights, he and Stanton used the steam generator to stay warm, trading stories of past repairs over the hiss of valves. Aaron's apprenticeship, book issued to record hours and tasks, contains a single entry in Stanton's spidery script: 4/12/80, 2, removed old expansion tank, installed new 30-gallon unit. Signed MS. That date sticks in Aaron's mind, a day before the official start of full-scale renovations. He remembers the blue work orders with embossed NYCHA seals, the auditioner's initials scrawled at the bottom. He remembers how they vanished from his book the next morning, replaced by a typed slip that bore only his name and hours worked. In the bustle of basement furnaces and clanking pipes, Aaron rarely questioned how invoices for subcontracted crews ended up in Stanton's desk drawer, neatly stacked and labeled "paid." He was too young to parse the absence of actual labor hours, the way sheet metal workers never showed up to fabricate the ducts they billed for. It was part of the unspoken rhythm: do the work you're given, file your hours, and leave the rest to the paperwork men. Yet even then, Aaron sensed a tension between the tangible and the documented. He felt it when he tried to verify the location of a missing staircase handrail, only to find the ledger marked "Installed Bullig Vive, Twund Floor," despite no rail ever appearing. He registered it as a minor curiosity, like a loose thread on a uniform. He tucked it away alongside his toolbox, moving on to the next task. When Stanton trained Aaron on lockbox protocol show to secure petty cash for emergency part, she did so with an almost conspiratorial hush, pressing the young apprentice to remember the old keys and combinations. Aaron understood those lessons as practical, not illicit. He did not yet know that the safe in Unit 4E would bear the silent fruit of those instructions 4 decades later, linking the arc of his career back to the man who first taught him to trust the cracks between paper and reality. When Aaron lifted the leather-bound ledger from the steel box, the musty scent of mildew mingled with the slick tang of aged ink. He turned to the first page, where a cramped hand had inscribed the heading, "Nicholas Houseson 1982 repair disbursements." Below it, columns of dates, payee names, project codes, and dollar amounts stretched on for over 100 entries. Each line bore a signature in blue-black pensum, flowing in confident loops, others stuttering in halting print. The earliest entries corresponded to visible work: boiler replacements and stairwell rail installation. Aaron traced his finger along April 12, 1982, the same date he'd installed the 30-gallon expansion tank as an apprentice. The amount, $48,750, matched the HUD-approved line item. The signature beneath, however, was not his foreman Stanton's familiar scrawl, but that of a city clerk named D. Harrow, a name Aaron did not recognize. As he flipped pages, the entries grew more curious. May 7, Foundation Clearance Building. 7, 123, 400. June 2, Elevator Modernization Towers 3, 5, 215, 0. June 15. Lead Paint Stabilization All Stairwells. 80, 7, 600. For each, the ledger listed a vendor and a signature by M. Stanton. Yet, no corresponding blueprints, no material requisition slips, and no inspection reports existed for those tasks. The handwriting matched Aaron's memory of Stanton's précis and ascendant, but the job descriptions described work that had never materialized. Tucked between the bound pages were manila envelopes stamped "City Contractor Priority." Inside each lay 10 to 20 bundles of 20 and 50 bills, still rubber-banded and intact. One envelope bore the name Harlem Plumbing Co. Account 4,000, 982, a subcontractor Aaron had never encountered. Another simply read, Urban Structurals. He rifled through the envelopes. None contained invoices, tax forms, or any documentation beyond the cash itself. On the back of one ledger page, someone had sketched a simple grid, vendor names in the left column, payment dates in the center, and a third column annotated Verified. Only a handful bore check marks. Next to Harlem Plumbing Co. and Urban Structurals, the boxes were blank. At the ledger's end, beneath Final Disbursement, October 1, 1982, a single scrawl read, Project Closed, Return Balance to Vault, signed simply D.H. Aaron recognized D.H. as Derek Harrow, a city office clerk who had overseen project disbursements that year. He recalled seeing Harrow at weekly briefings, an unremarkable man in a gray suit, ever polite but seldom speaking. At this late hour, Harrow's initials pressed into the page felt like a ghostly seal on an unspoken agreement. The ledger revealed deliberate inflation. Project codes duplicated funds for the same work. Dates overlapped. Signature styles of city liaisons reappeared in ink that had never dried on official correspondence. The faked vendors, Aaron realized, were front campania shells set up to funnel money under phantom contracts. At least one name in the ledger, L. Martinez, matched the signature of a now prominent member of the Housing Oversight Board. Holding the book, Aaron sensed how meticulously the scheme had been crafted. Forged signatures, rubber-stamped authorizations, and sealed envelopes hiding the true transfers. The ledger was more than evidence. It was a confession written in financial code, waiting for someone to translate its quiet arithmetic of deceit. And after 41 years, that translation had begun. Aaron sat alone in his modest kitchen, the leather ledger open on the table before him, along with a single manila envelope strewn with rubber-banded bills. The late afternoon light filtered through lace curtains, casting long shadows over the receipts he'd salvaged. Still, the gravity of what he held surpassed any tangible weight. 41 years of silence had compressed into a single moment of reckoning. He unfolded a small desktop phone directory, its pages dog-eared from past calls to former colleagues. At the top of the list was one name, Walter Walt Jensen, retired NYCHA supervisor, once in charge of all Harlem borough projects. Walt had trained Aaron in paperwork protocols decades ago and still maintained ties within City Hall connections that could spark a confidential review without immediate public exposure. Aaron dialed Walt's home number. Each ring echoed like a heartbeat in the empty apartment. On the third ring, a gruff voice answered. "Coles?" Walt said gravelly. "Didn't expect to hear from you." Aaron cleared his throat. "Got something you need to see, Walt. And I need to know it stays between us." There was a pause. "You know my line? You coming by?" Within half an hour, Aaron was sitting across from Walt in his faded recliner. The ledger lay between them on the coffee table, its cash bundles now unrolled into neat piles. Walt's hands trembled slightly as he leafed through the first pages, tracing the signatures and vendor entries. "Stanton, Harrowthy's names," Walt murmured. "I knew Harrow in '82. Quiet fellow, but clean record, or so we thought." His brow furrowed as he examined the verified column, noting the blanks beside shell company names. They staged this to look kosher. Who'd ever question a closed project after 4 decades? Aaron nodded. "That's why I called. If we go to the NYCHA Inspector General directly, it leaks. Then we lose control of the investigation. I want to keep this internal, get facts first." Walt leaned back, considering. He flipped open his old notebook, referencing names of contacts now scattered across various city agencies. "I'll reach out to one of my old contacts in the mayor's budget office private channel only. We'll ask for an audit of the '82 disbursement records for St. Nicholas, quietly. If they greenlight, we get files pulled, handwriting compared." Aaron glanced at the cash stacks, still bound in rubber bands, stamped with City Contractor, Priority. "What about the money?" Walt's jaw tightened. We let the IG worry about recovery later. First, we confirmed the ledger's authenticity. Then, we traced the paper trail. He closed his notebook. Tomorrow I'll make the call, but Colesue did the right thing bringing this to me. Just be ready if they ask questions. Aaron exhaled, relief and apprehension mingling. They arranged to meet again once Walt had an initial response. As Aaron packed the ledger and cash back into the steel box's protective case, the apartment felt colder somehow, every creak of the floorboards, a reminder that the building itself had been complicit in silencing the truth. He returned the box to his truck under the cover of dusk. The pipes in Unit 4E would be capped, the wall patched, the radiator humming again. But behind every surface, the safe lay quietly broken open, and a long-dormant scandal had begun to stir. In the early days of the internal review, NYCHA's Inspector General assembled a small team of records analysts, forensic accountants, and retired housing clerks to trace every inked flourish in the ledger. The operation unfolded in a secure conference room at City Hall, where long oak tables bore stacks of microfilm, carbon copies, and yellowed vouchers from 1982. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling shelving, each compartment labeled by project code. Among them, SNHRPR 82 was now the subject of intense scrutiny. First, the handwriting experts set to work. Under bright halogen lamps, they compared samples from the ledger signatures to archived personnel files. Michael Stanton's looping MS matched the foreman's apprenticeship book, affirming his role in authorizing phantom payouts. But it was the signature of L. Martinez that arrested the team's attention. Martinez's initials appeared on 23 entries, authorizing sums exceeding $500,000. When analysts pulled Martinez's city personnel file from 1991, they found the same flourish on a certificate appointing him to the Housing Oversight Board, a body created nearly a decade after the initial St. Nicholas project. Meanwhile, forensic accountants cross-referenced vendor names against business registries. Harlem Plumbing Co., account 4982, was registered for exactly 3 months in 1982 under a P.O. box in Queens. Its owner, a James Fulton, was unreachable. Fulton's social security number led to a defunct address. Urban Structurals had no registered office. Other vendors, like Metro Asphalt Services, showed valid credentials but no service records or complaints anywhere in NYCHA's maintenance logs. Each discrepancy deepened the sense of orchestration. At the same time, a retired clerk unearthed carbon duplicates of payment vouchers stamped "paid carbon duplicates never meant to survive beyond the audit cycle." Their edges were singed, as if to disguise their longevity. Yet hidden beneath the charred borders were faint imprints of dates and dollar amounts, matching entries in the ledger almost exactly. It was clear. Paper evidence had been intentionally aged and partially destroyed to deter later discovery. As forensic teams cataloged these findings, they noticed patterns. Vendor numbers were sequential, suggesting timetable fabrication. Signature inks were of uniform hue, despite spanning a 7-month period, an impossibility for pens in regular use. One analyst remarked, "It's like someone staged a photo shoot of their own corruption, then tried to burn the film." By midweek, a preliminary report had been drafted. It outlined the forged vendors, inflated invoices, and duplicated signature exhaustive evidence that the ledger was not an isolated curiosity but the blueprint of a calculated fraud. The report concluded with a stark observation. One of the ledger's principal signatories, L. Martinez, had leveraged a position on the oversight board to silence oversight mechanisms for decades. When the lead investigator presented these findings to the Inspector General, the room fell silent. A single phrase echoed from the report: "Paper doesn't forget." In that moment, the ledger's faded pages transcended their age. They became irrefutable testimony that, however long truth lay dormant behind a radiator, facts inscribed in ink could awaken justice even 41 years later. As the forensic audit deepened, investigators realized that St. Nicholas wasn't an outlier but part of a broader pattern. By overlaying payment records for Harlem with data from Brooklyn's Carroll Gardens houses and the Bronx's Morrisania houses, both sites in the same 1,982-83 repair cycle, a troubling choreography emerged. In Carroll Gardens, 950, zero of a $1.8 million renovation fund showed the same hallmarks: phantom vendors, inflated invoices, and missing inspection sign-offs. Morrisania's heating upgrade, budgeted at $2.1 million, similarly logged payments to a Metropolitan Thermal Services, a shell matching the urban structurals mold. Each project cited vendor delays as a convenient cover for halted work, yet disbursements continued long after crews vanished. Using digital forensics to map signature styles, analysts found that Stanton's handwriting, once thought exclusive to St. Nicholas, also appeared on ledgers from the other two sites. The looping M.S. initialed payments across boroughs, hinting at a centralized operation. Payments bore identical rubber band-stressed envelopes, ink tones, and even the same staggered date patterns, suggesting one orchestrator pulling strings from behind the scenes. Detectives reached out to former site supervisors and clerks. One Bronx supervisor recalled conveyor trucks leaving at dawn, loaded with construction debris, but no paperwork followed. A Brooklyn clerk recounted how invoices arrived in neat stacks, pre-signed by unknown hands. "We just processed them," he said. "If the paperwork looked right, it went through." As connections multiplied, the ledger from Unit 4E became a Rosetta Stone. Its vendors showed up in Brooklyn and the Bronx. Its forged signatures lined up with those auditors had flagged elsewhere. Investigators dubbed the operation Project Fade, a reference to both the faded ink and the vanishing funds. Meanwhile, public housing conditions across the three sites worsened. Tenants still shivered through winters without heat. Elevators broke down with mechanical fatalism. Stairwell lights sputtered out, forcing residents to navigate darkness. Reports of safety violations mounted, yet compliance logs remained bafflingly pristine. Each hazard marked addressed in systems that held no record of follow-through. By late October 2023, the Inspector General's office prepared a consolidated briefing. It included side-by-side comparisons of ledger entries, microfilm images of incinerated vouchers, and signed statements from former NYCHA personnel. 5 volumes of corroborating data made a single point: the St. Nicholas lockbox was not an isolated echo, but the keystone in a scheme that had siphoned over $4 million in repair funds citywide. When the briefing reached the mayor's legal counsel, the city faced a reckoning. Not only would Harlem's frozen Radiator lead to a reopened fraud case, but Carroll Gardens and Morrisania, their own scandals, would rise from long silence. A city once complacent now stood at the threshold of exposing decades of misappropriation, all traced back to a pattern of disappearance orchestrated in paper and shadow. By mid-November 2023, the Inspector General's team had traced every name in the St. Nicholas ledger to business registries and tax filings only to find mirrors of absence. Harlem Plumbing Co., once thought plausible, existed on paper for exactly 3 months in 1,982, its corporate address a UPS mailbox. Urban Structurals showed identical incorporation dates, listing the same P.O. box. Less overt fronts Metro Asphalt Services and Precision Piping, Repair, had fleeting tax returns, abruptly cut off mid-fiscal year. Behind each name, investigators uncovered the same pattern: shell corporations registered by a single Queens-based law firm, specializing in public works representation. Records obtained via subpoena revealed that the firm's lead partner, Frederick Alden, had overseen at least 7 such entities during that period. Alden's billing records found buried in microfichelisted fees for incorporation services tied to various NYCHA renovation projects, including Carroll Gardens and Morrisania. Further digging led to a former legal secretary who recalled handling paperwork for companies that never held office space or employees. "We'd set up the LLC, assign an agent, then collect fees, she later testified under oath. No one ever asked questions about operations. The final step, she said, was mailing the deed packets to Alden's office where they vanished into desk drawers. Meanwhile, forensic accountants mapped fund flows from NYCHA accounts to the shell corporation's bank accounts. The money moved through a network of clearinghouses, passing through at least 3 intermediary accounts before arriving in a single escrow reserved for capital improvements. From there, it dispersed in cash. Withdrawals bundles of 20s and 50s stacked in manila envelopes labeled City Contractor, Priority, identical to those found in Unit 4E. One envelope bore a faint stamp, Approved F.A. Alden, Esquire. It was the first direct paper tie to the law firm. Under careful magnification, the stamp's ink matched that on canceled checks for urban structurals found in the Bronx courthouse's discard bin. Parallel inquiries in Brooklyn and the Bronx uncovered comparable fronts. Each shell listed minimal capital, no staff, and the same typewritten letterhead. Where physical work was billed, there was no corresponding on-site damage or renovation record. Photographs from 1,982-83 city inspectors stored in deteriorating binders showed untouched stairwells and boiler rooms painted the same shade of grime as before the supposed repairs. Confronted with the compiled evidence, Alden's firm issued a terse statement. All incorporations were lawful. We provided administrative services only. But financial subpoena returns revealed that Alden had personally signed disbursement forms approving payments to his own client corporations. In conference rooms at City Hall, the phrase shadow vendors became shorthand for the deception's core, companies that existed only to launder public funds. For tenants of St. Nicholas, Carroll Gardens, and Morrisania, the term carried weight far beyond semantics. It was proof that their broken elevators and freezing winters were not random neglect, but the direct result of an engineered scheme conducted through faded letterheads and empty corporate shells. In early 1984, a mid-level project manager named Elena Park spotted an anomaly in the Morrisania file. Park, an engineer recently hired by NYCHA's Capital Projects Division, was reviewing monthly progress reports when she noticed disbursement slips for lead abatement work dated months after a building collapse had halted all interior repairs. The paperwork insisted work had resumed 3 separate entries, totaling 112,500. Yet Park's team had no records of permits, inspections, or material deliveries. She drafted a concise memo outlining the discrepancy and forwarded it to her direct superior, a deputy director in the Bronx Borough office. The cover note urged immediate verification and, if warranted, suspension of further payments. Park sealed the envelope and left it on her boss's desk before taking annual leave. She expected follow-up questions, but none came. Back at her desk 3 weeks later, Park found her memo returned, unfiled, its cover note handwritten. Reassigning to Harlem. See existing review. No docket number. No further instruction. The original memo lay beneath a stack of unrelated papers. Within days, she was reassigned to a temporary survey team inspecting roof leaks in Staten Island, an assignment outside her expertise and comfort zone. Park pressed for clarity, emailing her deputy. His reply was brief: capacity constraints. Administration will advise. When she asked again, the emails went unanswered. She interpreted the silence as direction. The Morrisania anomaly faded to the bottom of her inbox, then off the list entirely. Unbeknownst to Park, the internal audit queue was already laden with the St. Nicholas and Carroll Gardens reviews. NYCHA's Inspector General, swamped by parallel investigations, prioritized cases where hard evidence like the steel lockbox from Unit 4E already existed. The Morrisania query, lacking a physical lead or preserved records, was deprioritized and quietly shelved. In interviews decades later, Park described the moment she realized her memo had disappeared. "I thought it was incompetence," she said. "Not malice. Just bureaucracy, swallowing questions whole. But the impact was profound. Had her memo been acted upon, investigators might have uncovered shadow vendor patterns earlier, before the ledger in Harlem resurfaced. Across the city, other potential whistleblowers experienced similar fates. A Bronx clerk who flagged unreturned microfilm reels was told the reels were misplaced during office move. A Brooklyn inspector who questioned repeated invoices for the same stairwell rail installation was offered overtime to catch up on other borough reports and too exhausted to press on. By late 2023, when the Inspector General's consolidated report cited Park's memo as the first hint of Morrisania irregularities, she was long retired and living in upstate New York. She received a letter requesting her testimony along with an apology for the 40-year delay. Park's response was measured. "Paper isn't the only thing that forgets," she wrote. "But memories hold the gaps we must fill." Her overlooked warning underscored a bitter truth. In organizations built on files and forms, the loudest cases aren't always the ones that get heard. And sometimes, the whistle refuses to blow until decades later, when someone finally asks why it went silent. Decades of winter mornings in the St. Nicholas houses began with an anxious hush. Tenants shivering in thin robes, waiting for a furnace rumble that seldom came. Mrs. Delgado, a retired schoolteacher in Building 5, kept extra blankets in her hallway closet and boiled water on a hot plate to ward off frostbite. She recalled nights when her apartment's radiator hissed and then fell silent, as if it too had given up. Across the courtyard, Mr. Thompson, a wheelchair-bound veteran, once spent 2 nights in the stairwell under a wool coat because the elevator's broken motor trapped him on the 3rd floor and his building's heater had failed again. Inside utility closets, maintenance logs offered numbers divorced from lived experience. A February 1984 report noted "system check complete" and signed off by a contractor whose name never appeared on site. In January 1990, a notation read, "Boiler serviced," though tenants remembered ice-coating basement windows and pipes bursting under frozen pressure. Each entry in NYCHA's database felt like a promise unkept. The words existed, but the heat did not. Photographs from tenant-led community campaigns documented peeling paint, mold creeping over warped plaster, and steel radiators pocked with rust. In one image, a mother wraps her daughter's doll in an old coat, eyes fixed on a radiator valve dripping condensation into the carpet. In another, 2 children huddle by a space heater, the flickering flame illuminating a cracked ceiling overhead. These snapshots, once dismissed as anecdotal, revealed a cumulative toll: persistent cold exacerbating respiratory illnesses, structural decay heightening fire risk, and daily indignities eroding faith in city stewardship. Community board meeting minutes from 1995 onward carried a litany of complaints. Heat outage lasted 6 weeks. Elevator outage caused fall injuries. Boiler room flooded. Shutting off heat to Tower C. Each complaint ended with a generic response. Work order issued. Parts on back order. Budget constraints. Residents learned to translate these bureaucratic phrases into their stark realities. No follow-up, no visible work, no warmth. When investigators cross-referenced these records with payment ledgers from the 1982 project, the divergence was stark. Thousands of dollars earmarked for boiler replacement and radiant heat line installation bore signatures in the ledger's pages, yet the equipment never arrived. The same pattern echoed in Brooklyn and the Bronx. Invoices paid, reports filed, but no tangible service rendered. As one forensic accountant observed, every unheated apartment was a receipt unsigned by reality. By the time the Inspector General's report was released, the human cost had become unavoidable. Anecdotes of hypothermia, falls, and chronic illness gave way to a broader reckoning. Neglect was not passive, it was financed. For the residents of St. Nicholas houses, the ledger's cash bundles represented more than theft, they were the cold heart of a scheme that let their homes freeze. And after 41 years, the truth of their winters demanded restitution as much as revelation. In early December 2023, the Housing Oversight Board convened an emergency session to examine the Inspector General's consolidated findings. The boardroom at 250 Broadway was formal and austere. A long mahogany table flanked by portraits of past commissioners, a muted chandelier overhead, and redacted briefing binders stacked before each member. The agenda was terse: review the ledger evidence, assess conflicts of interest, and determine next steps. Among those called to testify was Lillian Martinez, whose signature appeared on dozens of forged disbursements. Martinez entered the room with deliberate composure, her tailored navy suit calibrated for authority. She took the central seat and exchanged glances with her counsel before the committee chair, former Deputy Mayor Robert Sinclair, opened the session. Sinclair read a summary of the ledger's reveal: unauthorized payments, shell, company schemes, and Martinez's role in clearing phantom invoices. He noted her current position as vice chair of the board, tasked with safeguarding tenants' interests, the very body now investigating her past. Martinez's name, once a symbol of integrity, now hung in the balance. Under questioning, Martinez acknowledged signing the monetary authorizations, but insisted she believed them to be routine procedural approvals. She claimed the ledger entries were standard and that she had no reason to suspect foul play. When asked about the absence of inspection reports and the ghost vendors, she replied, "I trusted the audit protocols in place. Any further inquiry would have been redundant in my view." Behind her, a legal advisor passed notes. The board's bylaws required recusal in cases of personal conflict. Yet Martinez had not disclosed her connection to Alden's law firm, a firm she had described as professional affiliates. The committee pressed on. Why had she never escalated the irregularities when internal memos flagged missing documentation? Martinez hedged, stating she deferred to NYCHA's compliance division. Across the table, board member Angela Ruiz, herself a former NYCHA tenant advocate, leaned forward. "Miss Martinez, constituents suffered freezing apartments and broken elevators. Tenants filed complaints that ended in no further action. Your signature greenlit budgets that never translated into repairs. How do you reconcile that?" Ruiz's voice was calm but firm. Martinez's pause was the first crack in her composure. She lowered her gaze and admitted she had misplaced concern, focusing instead on procedural output. "I see now that trusting the process without scrutiny was a mistake," she said. The committee adjourned to deliberate in private. An hour later, they returned with a resolution. Martinez would step down immediately from the board and submit to a full, independent ethics audit. Any breach of fiduciary duty would be referred to the City Commission on Public Integrity. The vote was unanimous. As Martinez packed her papers, residents and advocates outside the building watched through frosted glass, their breath fogging the windows. In that moment, the private weight of history became public reckoning. The Ethics Committee's actions transformed decades-old ledger lines into binding accountability, signaling that even institutional silence could no longer shield corrupt decisions from exposure. In mid-December 2023, Aaron found himself on a narrow stoop in Queens, waiting outside a modest bungalow where Michael Stanton, now 82, had lived for 20 years after retiring from NYCHA. The air was crisp, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked concrete. Aaron clutched the ledger's photocopies and a small packet of ink samples he'd secured from the Inspector General's Office of Procedural Necessity to compare Stanton's known signatures against those in the 1,982 entries. When Stanton appeared in the doorway, his posture was erect, eyes alert behind thick lenses. He stepped aside wordlessly, guiding Aaron into a cluttered living room filled with aging radiator parts, apprenticeship manuals, and stacks of yellowed blueprints pinned to corkboards. The sight of those familiar blueprints, hand-torn sheets marked up in red, ink sent a ripple of memory through Aaron, mingling gratitude for his training with the gravity of what he'd discovered. Aaron laid out the materials on Stanton's coffee table: ledger photocopies, signature comparisons, and ink vials. Stanton's gaze flicked from the documents to Aaron's face, then back. "You brought this back to me after 41 years, he said quietly. His voice, once booming in boiler rooms, now carried a brittle caution. Aaron watched Stanton's hands tremble as he matched the looping MS initials against the samples. The match was undeniable. Stanton's eyes closed for a moment. When he opened them, they were distant, as if recalling a time when decisions were made in hushed tones and shoved into desk drawers. "I never wanted you caught up in it," he murmured. He gestured at the apprenticeship manuals. "I taught you the craft, the respect for the building's bones. I never taught you how to sign away its repairs." He shook his head slowly. "I thought burying the truth in paper would protect everyone. I was wrong." Aaron pressed forward, recalling the ledger entries for phantom stairwell rails and boilers that never arrived. Stanton ran a gnarled finger over the edge of a creased blueprint. "We believed the money would follow the work," he said. "When the bids came in too high, we halved the work on paper. When no one noticed, we cut it entirely." His confession hung in the dusty air, an admission that systemic failings had been willfully concealed. The remaining minutes passed in subdued reflection. Stanton opened a dusty wooden box and withdrew an old set of Radiator keys, the same shapes Aaron had handled as an apprentice. "Keep these," Stanton said. "They unlocked more than valves." He offered no further defense. Aaron packed the keys and copied the confession into an audio recorder, the final piece of evidence needed to tie Stanton irrevocably to the scheme. As he left Stanton's house under a sky turning to twilight, Aaron felt the weight of history shift. The foreman's silence had shaped his early career. Now, Stanton's own words would help close the circle. Behind them, the ledger's rust-stained pages and faded ink would no longer whisper alone. They would speak loudly enough to break through 41 years of bureaucratic quiet. By January 2024, it was clear that criminal indictments were all but impossible. The statute of limitations for felony fraud on municipal contracts in New York State was 5 years, and the last overt act dated to October 1982. Nonetheless, city officials faced mounting political pressure to remedy decades of tenant neglect. With prosecutors sidelined, the mayor's office devised a remedial plan. A one-time, retroactive capital infusion for affected developments, financed by redirecting dormant funds and recovered administrative fees. The first step was a city council resolution, introduced quietly in mid-January. It acknowledged the Inspector General's findings, lamented institutional failures, and earmarked $5 million for urgent repairs at St. Nicholas, Carroll Gardens, and Morrisania houses. Because direct recovery of misappropriated funds through civil suits was deemed prohibitively complex and costly, the resolution relied instead on unclaimed vendor retainage small balances held in escrow by the city's finance department for decades. Within days, NYCHA's Capital Projects Division reactivated repair contracts for Harlem. New scaffolding rose around Building 5 by early February. Modern boilers and heat exchangers, specified in HUD's original scope, finally arrived. Elevator motors were overhauled, stairwell railings installed to current code. All work was documented in live tracking software, with real-time photos and tenant notifications. At community board meetings, NYCHA project managers presented before and after comparisons. Archival photos of rusted radiators beside gleaming new units. Floor plans annotated with replaced kerosene-fumed pipes. Digital dashboards showing completion timelines. Residents like Mrs. Delgado and Mr. Thompson spoke on camera, grateful for warmth and accessibility, yet mindful of the long hiatus they'd endured. Behind the scenes, the mayor's budget office assessed administrative recoveries. Fees collected from shell corporations, those same shadow vendors, run through dormant accounts totaled a few $100,000. Though insufficient to cover the full $1.7 million loss, these funds supplemented the emergency allocation. More significant was the symbolic weight. The city admitted institutional culpability and took tangible steps to restore services. Aaron Coles monitored the progress from the periphery, accepting an invitation to the recommitment ceremony at St. Nicholas. He watched as a newly appointed NYCHA superintendent cut a ceremonial ribbon with tenants and elected officials. He noticed a small plaque installed in the boiler room, honoring the perseverance of tenants and the dedication of audit staff who reminded us that walls have ears and safes have stories. The inscription omitted Stanton's name but spoke to the quiet persistence that had brought the ledger to light. There was no fanfare of legal Victorino gavel, no courtroom drama. Instead, a practical resolution. Roofs reinforced, boilers humming, elevators ascending. The ledger remained in the Inspector General's archive, unsealed but inactive, a reminder of a scandal that bureaucratic silence had nearly buried. In Harlem, the radiators rattled back to life. And though the money itself was never fully clawed back, the warmth that flooded apartments carried its own restitution. Unofficial justice, born from a broken pipe and a buried safe, had finally begun to thaw 4 decades of cold neglect. In mid-February 2024, Aaron Coles returned to Unit 4E under a gray winter sky. The hallway's fluorescent lights hummed steadily, no longer flickering from power surges. He carried only a small satchel inside it, a clean copy of the 1982 ledger now declassified and digitized, its edges crisp despite the years it had spent sealed away. Stepping into the apartment, Aaron noted the fresh plaster patch where the radiator casing once hid the steel box. The wall was smooth, painted a neutral beige that blended with the rest of the living room. No trace remained of the safe's outline, only a faint rectangle where paint tones whispered of repair. The tenant, now in her mid-80s, greeted him with a gentle nod. She held 2 cups of tea in chipped mugs, their rims lined with thin cracks. They sat side by side on a worn sofa, its cushions sighing under their weight. Aaron set the satchel on the coffee table and extracted the ledger printout. He slid it across to her, letting the pages fall open at the faded cover title. Nicholas House's own 1982 repair disbursements. The tenant traced a trembling finger along the typed lines, her eyes reflecting decades of frustration and, now, vindication. "I kept every letter you sent," she said quietly, recalling the peeling pamphlets and unanswered complaints. "But this," she tapped the ledger copy. "This is the first time I've seen names." Aaron nodded. "They'll all be in the archives at City Hall. Anyone who wants to see how the money vanished can walk the hallways of those records." He imagined the leather-bound original, now locked behind glass, its ink no longer secret. For a moment, they sat in silence, listening to the subtle hum of the heating system, new boilers at work, valves recently replaced. The apartment felt warmer than it had in years, not solely from the radiator's soft whistle, but from a sense of closure settling between them. Outside, snow began to dust the courtyard. Children trudged past, their laughter muffled by knitted scarves and the cold air. In the lobby, new bulletin boards displayed project timelines and tenant feedback channels. Aaron realized that the ledger's story, once confined to cracked walls and hidden safes, had translated into real change. Improved maintenance protocols, transparent budgets, and community oversight panels. He rose, gathering his satchel. The tenant placed a hand on his arm. "Thank you," she whispered, "for remembering." Aaron paused at the doorway, his gaze drifting to the patched wall. "No one remembers perfectly," he replied, "but sometimes the smallest cracks let the light in." As he walked down the stairwell, each step felt lighter. In the city archives, the ledger awaited researchers, historians, and any citizen determined to learn from its pages. Its final entry, "Project closed. Return balance to vault," had become a prologue for renewal rather than an epilogue for concealment. And though the original safe was gone, its legacy remained, a testament that, however long truth lies hidden, it can never be truly sealed away.